Hello everyone who has come and listened. I am Jay. Today I would like to tell you a story. Morgan Freeman and the inspirational story of facing a rude talk show host. Please listen. The studio was alive with anticipation. Bright lights illuminated the sleek, modern set, and every seat in the audience was taken. Millions of viewers across the country had tuned in, waiting to witness what promised to be an unforgettable interview. At the center of it all sat Olivia Ramsey, a talk show host with a reputation for pushing her guests to the edge. Known for her relentless, no-holds-barred approach, she thrived on controversy and confrontation. Tonight, her target was none other than Morgan Freeman, a Hollywood legend, a man whose voice had narrated the essence of life itself. Freeman entered the stage with a slow, deliberate stride. He was 86 years old, but there was still power in the way he carried himself, graceful, commanding, yet effortlessly calm. The moment he appeared, the audience erupted into applause. Some stood, while others wiped away tears, knowing they were in the presence of a living icon. Freeman nodded in quiet acknowledgement, then took his seat across from Olivia. But something felt off. Olivia leaned forward, her fingers tapping against the desk, her smirk barely concealed. She had done countless interviews, but this one felt different. She wasn't here to celebrate Morgan Freeman's legacy. She was here to dismantle it. In her earpiece, her producer's voice crackled, "Make this one count. Push him. Get the headline." Olivia adjusted in her chair, exhaled sharply, and gave a practiced smile. The camera zoomed in. "Mr. Freeman," she began, her voice smooth yet calculated, "at 86, do you ever wake up wondering if today might be your last?" The audience gasped. The air shifted. The storm had begun. The silence that followed Olivia's question was suffocating. The air inside the studio, moments ago electric with admiration, had turned cold. The audience, caught between disbelief and discomfort, exchanged uneasy glances. Even the camera crew hesitated, unsure whether to zoom in on Morgan Freeman's face or Olivia's smirk, which only widened as she leaned back in her chair, waiting for his response. Morgan Freeman didn't flinch. His hands remained folded on the table, his deep-set eyes locked onto Olivia with an unsettling stillness. He had been in Hollywood for decades, had faced journalists of all kinds, yet this moment felt different. There was no curiosity in Olivia's tone, only provocation. She wasn't here to listen. She was here to tear him down. The tension stretched unbearably. The audience barely breathed. Then Freeman exhaled, his voice a steady force that cut through the silence like a blade. "Miss Ramsey," he said, his tone calm but piercing, "have you ever held someone's hand as they took their last breath?" The question landed like a thunderclap. Olivia blinked. Her smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second, but Freeman caught it. So did the audience. A murmur rippled through the crowd, the weight of his words pressing down on them. Olivia shifted in her seat, but she was too good at this game to let herself look rattled. She let out a short, forced laugh. "I don't make a habit of sitting around deathbeds, Morgan." Freeman nodded slowly, his fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair, his expression unreadable. "Maybe you should," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unshakable authority. "It teaches you what really matters." The studio fell into a deeper silence, the kind that makes people uncomfortable because it forces them to reflect. Olivia's producer's voice crackled into her earpiece, growing impatient. "Move on, Olivia. Control the room." She straightened her shoulders, shaking off the creeping sensation that she was no longer in charge. No, she wouldn't let him do this. She had prepared for this moment, had studied every inch of his career, had picked the exact words to throw him off balance. If he thought he could turn the tables, he was dead wrong. She forced a smirk. "Let's be honest, Morgan," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Hollywood is done with you. The industry has moved on. People remember stars when they shine, not when they fade. How does it feel knowing you're a relic of the past?" A sharp intake of breath spread through the audience. Even the crew behind the cameras stiffened. This wasn't just an insult. This was an attempt to erase him. For the first time, something flickered in Freeman's eyes. Not anger, not offense, but something heavier. A truth he had long understood but never spoken aloud. He let the question linger in the air before responding. He inhaled, then exhaled, slow and steady. "Do you know how many calls I get in a year, Olivia?" His voice was softer now, but no less powerful. "How many directors say, 'Morgan, we need you'?" The audience hung on his words. Olivia, despite herself, leaned in. Not many anymore. A few gasps escaped the crowd. Freeman nodded, as if confirming what they already suspected. "I know what it feels like to be forgotten," he continued, his voice dipping lower. "But I also know that relevance doesn't define worth." The energy in the room had changed. Freeman was no longer just answering questions. He was commanding the space. Olivia felt a prickle of unease creep up her spine. This was not how she had envisioned the interview going. She was supposed to be the one in control, the one steering the conversation. Yet here she was, feeling like a spectator in her own show. For the first time in her career, she felt afraid. The studio's energy had shifted into something thick and unspoken, a tension neither Olivia nor the audience could ignore. The weight of Morgan Freeman's words hung in the air, pressing down on her like an unseen force. For the first time, she felt exposed, as if the spotlight wasn't just illuminating the set, but peeling back the carefully constructed armor she had worn for years. But Olivia Ramsey wasn't about to let that happen. She straightened in her chair, masking the unease creeping up her spine. Freeman might have thrown a counterpunch, but she refused to lose control of this interview. Her producer's voice hissed into her earpiece. "Take back the room, Olivia. Push harder. Break him." Her pulse quickened. If she let him dictate the pace, the story would become his, not hers. And she had worked too damn hard for that. A slow, deliberate smirk curled on her lips. "So, you admit it then, Morgan?" she said, tilting her head, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Hollywood doesn't need you anymore. The cameras, the studios, the directors, they've moved on. And yet, here you are, clinging to the past, hoping someone will still care." A sharp murmur rippled through the crowd. Even those who had come to admire Freeman now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Olivia had just crossed a line, and she knew it. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice to a near whisper, weaponizing her next words. "Be honest, Morgan. What does it feel like to be forgotten?" The impact was instant. A hush fell over the room, the kind that crawls under your skin and makes you uneasy. The audience stopped breathing. The crew behind the cameras froze. Even Olivia's producer, who had been encouraging her to push, didn't say a word. But Freeman, he just sighed. Not in defeat, not in anger, but in something deeper, understanding. He looked at Olivia, not as a journalist, not as an opponent, but as a person. A person who was hiding something. "Olivia," he said finally, his voice a steady, unshakable force. "Who did you lose?" The question was a bullet through the facade she had spent years perfecting. Her fingers tightened around the cue cards in her lap. She blinked, not because she didn't understand the question, but because she did. And that terrified her. Freeman nodded slightly, as if he already knew the answer. "Someone close to you, someone you never got to say goodbye to." Olivia's throat closed. Her hands trembled. For a split second, the camera caught it. The way her breathing changed, the way her smirk faded, the way the mask she wore so well began to crack. She tried to fight back. She had to. Her voice wavered, but she forced out a laugh. "Nice try, Morgan, but I'm the one asking the questions." Freeman didn't argue. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, everyone watching had already seen the truth. The moment Morgan Freeman asked the question, the entire studio froze. "Who did you lose?" It was a simple question, but it landed like a wrecking ball, shattering the carefully curated armor Olivia Ramsey had spent years perfecting. The color drained from her face, her fingers tightening around her cue cards, as if they were the only thing anchoring her. She forced herself to breathe, to blink, to keep the rising panic from reaching her eyes. But she knew. Morgan saw through her. The audience saw it too. Freeman didn't press. He didn't need to. He simply watched her, his silence more powerful than any accusation. He had spent a lifetime studying people, and right now he saw a woman at war with herself. The producer's voice crackled in Olivia's earpiece, sharp, urgent. "Don't let him control this, Olivia. Stay on script. Get him back on the defensive." Her jaw clenched, her pulse pounded. No, she wouldn't let this happen. Not here, not now. With a slow exhale, she forced a smirk, though her lips felt like lead. "Nice try, Morgan," she said, her voice tight, "but I'm the one asking the questions." The tension in the room was suffocating, thick enough to choke on. Freeman didn't flinch. He let the silence stretch, let it suffocate her, let the weight of the unspoken truth hang in the air. The audience, wide-eyed, barely breathing, sat motionless. Then Olivia made her move. She straightened her shoulders, inhaled sharply, and threw her final dagger. "What do you want to be remembered for, Morgan?" Her voice was steady, but the audience could hear it. The edge of desperation, the need to shift the power back into her hands. Freeman tilted his head slightly, studying her the way a man studies a storm on the horizon. His deep eyes held no anger, no offense, only something softer, something knowing. Then, instead of answering, he asked, "The real question, Olivia, is what will they remember about you?" The room collectively gasped. For the first time, Olivia Ramsey was speechless. The cameras zoomed in. The audience leaned forward, caught in the gravity of the moment. Her throat tightened, her hands curled into fists on the desk, her nails digging into her palm. She had spent her career asking the questions that made others squirm, the ones that exposed weakness, regret, vulnerability. But now, she was the one on the other side, and she had no answer. The walls she had built around herself felt like they were closing in. The lights were too bright, the silence was too loud. The producer's voice screamed in her ear, "Say something, Olivia. Cut to commercial. Do something." But she couldn't. Because for the first time in her career, Olivia Ramsey wasn't in control. Morgan Freeman was. The silence in the studio was no longer just tense. It was crushing. The air felt thick, pressing down on Olivia Ramsey as if the weight of the entire room had suddenly collapsed onto her shoulders. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Morgan Freeman's words still echoed in her head, pounding like a war drum. "The real question, Olivia, is what will they remember about you?" She tried to swallow, but her throat felt tight, dry, like she had been backed into a corner with no way out. She had spent years mastering the art of control, of steering conversations exactly where she wanted them to go. But now, she was trapped. And Morgan Freeman knew it. Then, before she could recover, a voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Freeman." It was low, shaky, filled with something deeper than just emotion. The cameras shifted. The audience turned. An elderly man, standing in the second row, had risen from his seat. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the back of the chair in front of him. His white hair was thin, his face lined with the passage of time. But his eyes burned with something unmistakable. Recognition. "I fought in a war." His voice, though unsteady, carried across the room with undeniable strength. Olivia blinked, momentarily snapping out of her daze. Who was this man? Morgan Freeman turned to face him, his expression shifting, not with surprise, but with understanding. He knew this moment was bigger than the interview, bigger than both of them. The man took a deep breath, steadying himself, and then spoke again. "I lost everything. My friends, my home, my family, and when I came back, the world forgot me." His voice cracked, but he pressed on. "But tonight, he reminded me that I still matter." A shudder rippled through the audience. Someone in the front row covered their mouth, stifling a sob. Others weren't as composed. Tears openly ran down their faces. Even Olivia felt something shift inside her. For years, she had built her career on headlines, controversy, power. But this moment, this wasn't a story she could spin. This was real. Freeman's eyes softened as he nodded slowly. "You were never forgotten, my friend." The veteran swallowed hard, gripping the chair in front of him as though he were holding on to something far greater than just words. "Then why does it feel like I was?" That was when Olivia felt her stomach drop. Because for the first time since the interview started, she wasn't just a host. She was part of this conversation. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her cue cards. Not to read from them, but to do something, anything, to ground herself. Because suddenly, without warning, the question that had just been thrown at her felt personal. What will they remember about you? The same world that had forgotten this man would one day forget her too. The realization hit her like a freight train. And just like that, Olivia Ramsey, for the first time in her life, was afraid. The studio had transformed into something else entirely. This was no longer an interview. It was a reckoning. Olivia Ramsey, the unshakable, unbreakable talk show host, was unraveling before the eyes of millions. Her fingers clenched tightly around the cue cards, but she wasn't reading them. She wasn't even sure she could see the words printed on them. Her mind was a storm. The war veteran's voice still echoed in her head. But tonight, you reminded me that I still matter. For the first time, she felt naked under the studio lights, exposed in a way she had never been before. The producer's voice hissed in her earpiece, sharp and urgent. Olivia, regain control. Move on. Cut to commercial if you have to. She should have listened. She should have done something, anything, to steer the moment back to where she was in control. But she couldn't. Because Morgan Freeman was still watching her. His gaze wasn't unkind. It wasn't judgmental, but it was knowing, as if he saw through every word she had ever said, through the sharp edges of her career, through the years she had spent dismantling people on live television, through every interview where she had sat across from someone, pressing them, pushing them, forcing them to reveal their darkest truths. And now, for the first time, she was the one in the hot seat. Freeman's voice was gentle when he spoke, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. Olivia, he said, who did you lose? The words slammed into her like a physical blow. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. Her chest tightened. The walls of the studio felt like they were closing in. The audience, the cameras, the lights, they all blurred together. It wasn't just a question. It was the question. A breath shuddered through her lips. Her body wanted to fight, wanted to push back like she always had. But her mind was already in the past. A memory crashed into her, one she had buried for years. A folded American flag, a polished wooden coffin, a war hero's funeral, her father's funeral. He had been a soldier, a man who had fought, survived, only to come home and feel forgotten. And worst of all, she hadn't been there when he took his last breath. Olivia felt her pulse hammer against her ribs. She blinked rapidly, willing herself to stay composed, but the moment was slipping through her fingers. She felt something hot and unfamiliar sting her eyes. Not now. Not here. She clenched her jaw, forced herself to breathe. Then somehow, she found her voice. It was quieter than before, unsteady. My father? The moment the words left her lips, the audience gasped. Freeman nodded as if he had known all along. Olivia swallowed hard. Her throat burned. He was a soldier, too. She let the words hang in the air, their weight pressing down on her. The energy in the room had changed. This wasn't about fame or controversy anymore. This was real. For the first time in her career, Olivia Ramsey wasn't the one leading the conversation. And it terrified her. The words hung in the air, heavy, inescapable. My father, he was a soldier too. Olivia hadn't meant to say it. She hadn't planned to let it slip. But once the words left her lips, they became undeniable. The audience was frozen in shock. Even the crew behind the cameras, veterans of the industry, accustomed to the theatrics of live television, were motionless, caught in the gravity of the moment. Olivia Ramsey, the woman known for breaking others down, had just broken herself open. Morgan Freeman's expression softened. He didn't gloat. He didn't press further. He simply waited. And that, more than anything, made Olivia's heart pound. The producer's voice erupted in her earpiece, frantic, desperate. Olivia, pivot now. You're losing control. Change the subject. She should have. She should have pulled herself together, thrown out another calculated question, done anything to reclaim the power that had just slipped through her fingers. But she didn't, because for the first time in years, Olivia wasn't thinking about the ratings or the headlines or the power plays. She was thinking about him, her father, A man who had served his country, sacrificed everything, and died alone. A man she had never truly mourned because burying her emotions had been easier than facing them. She felt something sharp in her chest. Grief, guilt, regret. It ached, and Freeman saw it. That's when he spoke again, his voice steady, gentle. "Olivia, do you know the difference between fear and faith?" The question caught her off guard. She blinked, her breath unsteady. She didn't answer. So he did. Fear is believing in the worst that could happen. His voice was low, deliberate. Faith is believing in the best. A soft gasp came from somewhere in the audience. The room shuddered under the weight of his words. Tears welled in Olivia's eyes, and this time, she didn't blink them away. The lights above her weren't just bright, they were blinding. Her body felt hot, shaky, like she was teetering on the edge of something she couldn't name. She had spent her entire career wielding fear like a weapon, manipulating it, controlling it, using it to break others down. But faith? Faith was something she had never trusted, because faith required letting go. "Every morning I wake up and I choose faith," Freeman continued. "Even when the world forgets. Even when the calls stop coming. Even when I know my time here is almost up." The audience was no longer watching a talk show. They were witnessing something transformative, and Olivia Ramsey was at the center of it. Her breath hitched. Her hands trembled as they rested in her lap. She was afraid. But for the first time, she wondered, what if she didn't have to be? The studio was completely silent. Morgan Freeman's words had not just been spoken, they had landed. They had settled into the bones of every person in that room, each syllable carrying the weight of something deeper than wisdom, truth. Olivia Ramsey sat frozen in her chair. Her perfectly calculated posture was gone. The sharp, cutting presence she had wielded so effectively throughout her career had dissolved. She wasn't in control anymore, and for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to be. The audience wasn't watching a polished, ruthless journalist. They were watching a human being come undone. She inhaled sharply, but her breath caught in her throat. Fear is believing in the worst that could happen. Faith is believing in the best. Freeman's words clawed at something inside her, something she had buried a long time ago. She had always chosen fear, fear of being forgotten, fear of not being powerful enough, fear of losing control. She had built an entire career on making people afraid, on making them doubt themselves, so she could sit in the illusion of strength. But sitting here, across from Morgan Freeman, a man who had spent decades being a light in an industry that tried to push him into the shadows, she realized something. She was the one who had been lost all along. Her fingers trembled as she slowly removed her earpiece. Her producer's voice, once barking orders, once dictating her every move, was gone. She was alone now. No script, no control, just the truth. She swallowed hard, lifted her gaze, and looked at Morgan Freeman, not as a journalist, not as an adversary, but as a person seeking answers. Her voice was soft when she finally spoke. "Morgan, if you had one last message for the world, what would it be?" The audience leaned in. Freeman exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest of his chair. His deep-set eyes held a knowing sadness, but also something stronger. Hope. "Life isn't measured by the years we live," he said, "but by the love we give." A wave of emotion rippled through the room. Someone in the front row let out a soft sob. Others wiped their eyes, clutching the hands of the people next to them. Even the camera crew, trained to be distant, detached from the emotions unfolding on set, were visibly shaken. But the most shocking reaction of all? Olivia Ramsey was crying. Not just a single tear, not just a brief flicker of emotion before she regained composure, but openly, visibly breaking down. She pressed a hand to her chest as if something had physically cracked inside her. Morgan Freeman just watched her, his expression unreadable. The studio had become something more than just a place for entertainment. It was a moment in history, a moment of reckoning, a moment that no one would ever forget. And then Olivia did something no one expected. She reached up, unhooked her microphone, and stood up. She turned toward the audience, then toward the cameras broadcasting this to millions across the country. Her voice was quiet, almost fragile, but sincere. "We'll be right back." And just like that, the screen cut to black. The world held its breath. The aftermath. A question for you. That night, the clip of the interview went viral. Within hours, it had been shared millions of times, spreading across every platform. But the conversation wasn't about Morgan Freeman. It wasn't even about the interview itself. It was about what happened next. Because after the cameras stopped rolling, after Olivia Ramsey left the set, she disappeared. No social media posts, no damage control, no statements, just silence. And that silence left one question hanging in the air. Did Olivia Ramsey change? Did the woman who had spent years tearing others down finally understand what it meant to build something instead? Did she choose fear, or did she choose faith? We may never know. But maybe, just maybe, that's not the real question. Maybe the real question is for you. What will they remember about you? When your time comes, when your story is told, will you be remembered for the power you held, or for the love you gave? Now, we turn it over to you. What part of Morgan Freeman's message resonated with you the most? If you had one last message for the world, what would it be? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your story. And if this moment moved you, if it made you reflect, then hit the like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because at the end of the day, life isn't measured by the years we live, but by the love we give. Subscribe for more stories that make you think, feel, and remember what really matters. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like, share, and leave comments for the story.